let's talk love-hate relationships for just a minute, if we can. I mean, you guys know what this is, right? A love-hate relationship. It's like the intense feelings and emotions that two people have toward each other, one way or the other. So probably the best example of a love-hate relationship is that between Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy. Where are my Pride and Prejudice people at? All the ladies in the house, right, okay. All right, so I get it. Maybe that doesn't resonate with everybody. Okay, so how about this one? Since we've got like this 90s vibe going on this week, let me talk about my favorite love-hate relationship of all time, and that is between Julia Stiles and Heath Ledger. Name that movie. 10 Things I Hate About You. It's so good. They don't make high school rom-coms like that anymore, okay? So if you haven't seen it, you should. There's everything from poetry to paintball, so a little something for everybody, okay? That's a love-hate relationship. But here's the thing, and I think you guys know this, love-hate relationships don't always have to be between two people. See, there can be a love-hate relationship between a person and an inanimate object. For example, I love ice cream. I love it, and I could eat it every single day, except for the fact that I'm no longer a teenager, so I hate what it does on my waistline, you get it. Or maybe you love shopping, but you hate spending your own money. Or, you have loved every single minute you have spent watching Marvel's 22 film series over the last 11 years. Yep. But you hate how many tears you shed during Endgame. Am I right? I love you 3,000. Okay, I know. Okay, so love-hate relationships, you get it. We all have them, right? And I personally have a love-hate relationship with mountains. Now, I love mountains. I love the clean, fresh air in the mountains. I love the starry skies in the mountains. I love the beauty and the majesty. In fact, every time I play the game, Would You Rather, and the question comes up, would you rather vacation in the mountains or at the beach? I choose the mountains, and I don't hate the beach. I love everything about it. It's good, smoky campfire. But here's the thing. I had an experience with a mountain one time that I thought was going to be the end of me. So I grew up in the Midwest, and in the Midwest, for those of you who live there, you get this. In the Midwest, when we think of mountains, we just think of like a really great sledding hill, because that's all we got. But then, after I got married, my husband and I moved to Southern California, and the very next summer, I decided to sign myself up for a 5-day hike in the high Sierra Nevadas. Now, you need to understand, I had never done anything like this before in my life. I had never hiked that many miles. I had never spent that kind of time in that high of an altitude. I had never carried a 25-pound pack on my back before. Never done any of this, but I was 100% sure I could. So the first few days were pretty good. They were okay. We just did a really nice, slow pace. We hiked about 8 to 10 hours a day, but it was a slow incline so that we could acclimate to the altitude, so it was okay. But then came the day that we were going to summit a 14er. The majestic Mount Langley is the 9th highest peak in California. She stands at about 14,026 feet, give or take. But even with that information, I wasn't intimidated, because the trailhead to go up to the summit actually started at 10,000 feet. So in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, so we're only hiking 4,000 feet. This can't be that bad, right? The thing is, they were 4,000 vertical feet. So for the first 2,000 feet, I just put my head down, I found a doable pace, and I just kept telling myself, you can do this. For the next 1,000 feet, I began to question whether or not this was really a very good idea. And when everyone in my hiking group passed me by, I felt no shame. But I did come up with about 14 different ways I was going to die, and they were never going to find my body. And then for the final 1,000 feet, I pretty much just cried. I had blisters on my heels, because apparently my feet were moving weirdly in my boots, like differently than they did the days before. I had blisters on my hands from gripping my walking sticks too tightly. I had blisters on my ears, because I didn't realize that the higher you go, the thinner the air becomes and the more exposed you are to the sun. So by the time that I actually reached the last ledge to just climb over and get to the summit, I was feeling all the feelings. I was exhausted. I was dehydrated. I was in pain. I was weepy. And then the first person that I lay my eyes on is a teenage boy from my hiking group. And he has the gall to look at me and say, "Mrs. DeFazio, you actually made it?" So then I just felt angry, like, so, listen here, Sonny, all the feelings. But then when I finally stumbled up to that ledge, and I lifted up my eyes for the first time that day, I could not breathe. And it wasn't because there's no oxygen up there, although that is true. No, I couldn't breathe because I saw the Lord. And it took me almost 8 stinking hours to hike up that dang summit and another 5 to get back down. And I'm telling you, I was despairing in every way. But when I stepped out of the shadows into the glorious light, God met me there. And the moments that I spent in His presence, even in the middle of one of the hardest things I have ever done in my life, it was worth it. He is worth it. Mountains, you gotta love them, even when you kind of hate them. And I think Elijah would agree. So tonight we're going to open back up to Elijah's story, and we are right in the midst of a tale of 2 mountains. Because see, in just the span of a few verses, in the space of just over a month's time, Elijah goes from the pinnacle of his ministry to the pit. From the heights of Mount Carmel and the grandest day on which God has ever answered a mortal man's prayer to a dry and weary desert, completely devoid of any spiritual passion and power. In 1 Kings chapter 18, Elijah's career hit its peak on Mount Carmel. But in chapter 19, we see him plummet on top of Mount Sinai. So let's take a look at what happens. We're going to start in verse 9. It says, "There he went into a cave, and he spent the night. And the word of the Lord came to him, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?' He replied, 'I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too.' The Lord said, 'Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by.' And then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. After the fire came a gentle whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face, and he went out and he stood at the mouth of the cave. And then a voice said to him, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?' And he replied, 'I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. See, the Israelites, they've rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too.' And the Lord said to him, 'Go back the way you came, and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael, king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel, and anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat from Abel-Meholah, to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all of whose knees have never bowed down to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him.'" All right, so let's go back to the top here. Let's go back to verse 9. Because the first thing that we see in this part of Elijah's story is that he is running away and he enters into a cave to hide. But this is really strange because we haven't seen this kind of behavior nor this kind of despondency from Elijah before. So what's changed exactly? Well, I mean, for starters, if you just read back through the story of Elijah, you'll quickly see that God specifically sent Elijah into all of the places where he was successful. But God did not send Elijah here. God did not send Elijah on the run from Jezebel. So it would seem that part of Elijah's new demeanor has to do with the fact that it was Jezebel's threats and not God's promises that are motivating Elijah's actions. But I mean, I'm not blaming the guy, because Jezebel's straight crazy, okay? Can we just take a moment and spill the tea on villains? Can we do that? Okay? Because here's the thing. Let's just talk about Disney villains. I know there are some of you in this room who actually love the villains more than the princesses. Where are you at? Yeah. This is why Descendants is such a thing that it is, right? You love the villains. So I know you've noticed this before. But the male Disney villains, think about ones like Gaston, Clayton from Tarzan, even Jafar. These guys all look really normal. Like they're dumber than a box of rocks, but they're not all that intimidating. Some might even say they're handsome. But on the flippity flip, take a look at the female villains for a minute. Like, what is going on? We've got Ursula, we've got Cruella de Vil, we've got the witch from Snow White. I could go on. The Queen of Hearts, Maleficent. You guys know this. This is the stuff of nightmares. Because Disney knows. They ain't nothing scarier than a woman's wrath. Am I right? And this is why Jezebel has my vote for top 5 biblical villains of all time. She's crazy. But here's the interesting thing about it. See, Jezebel, she could have killed Elijah the very same day that she heard he had killed all of her prophets, but she waits. I mean, it seems odd, right? Like, if she's that upset about it, why not just execute the guy and make an example out of him? Oh, but ladies, we know what she's up to here, don't we? Because see, when a man crosses us, we could strike in the moment, but then our nemesis wouldn't feel the full weight of our rage. But if we tell him what we're going to do, but not when we're going to do it, if we make him wait, if we make him sit in it, well, then he will know terror. See, I told you, females make the best villains, right? Like, it's just a thing. Yeah, I know, thank you. Okay, so Jezebel, I mean, she's real, she's legit, and it's no wonder Elijah is scared. But here was her plan. Jezebel's plan was just to scare Elijah enough to get him out of her territory, to scare him enough to get him away from further influencing her people, because she knew that if he would just run and hide, then his reputation would be tarnished and her power would be reestablished. End of story. But here's what Jezebel didn't understand. It wasn't her story. So see, when Jezebel thought that she was crippling Elijah under the full weight of her power, she was actually leading him straight into the full weight of God's. So yeah, it's no surprise that Elijah finds himself in such desperate shape. But look back at verse 9. Even in Elijah's despair, God is there. And so God asks Elijah, "What are you doing here?" And Elijah responds in sheer panic. "I have been zealous for the Lord, but the Israelites haven't. They've rejected you. They've killed their own prophets. Now I'm the only one left. They want to kill me too." Now, first of all, let's just look at this question. I want you to understand, this question that God asks, this is not some philosophical, big question of the cosmos. What is your meaning in life? No, it's not that. This is a very specific, very pointed question. God asks Elijah, "What are you doing here? What are you doing on Mount Horeb, on Mount Sinai? Because I did not send you here. This is not my plan for you. This is not my plan for my people, and you know that. So what are you doing here, Elijah?" But see, Elijah thinks this is the perfect place to talk to God about the covenant. This is the perfect place for him to point out that Israel has broken God's promise, because this is the exact place where God first made this covenant with Abraham. And so Elijah comes to this mountaintop and he tells God, "Man, your people have failed you. They've broken the covenant. They've killed your own people. They're not the people that you need them or desire them to be. I'm the only one doing the right thing." He's freaking out. Now, some of what Elijah says is true here. Israel has broken their relationship with God multiple times. They have killed God's messengers, their own people. But it also seems to me that Elijah is a bit blinded by self-preservation here. Because he seems to have forgotten about the faithful Obadiah and the 100 other prophets of Israel who are also hidden in caves right now. I mean, I think because of Elijah's fear, he is now unable to imagine that God has been at work anywhere else but on top of Mount Carmel. That God is not just lighting bowls on fire, he's lighting hearts on fire. And because of his fear-filled blindness, Elijah is now clinging to the words of a crazed queen rather than those of the creator and sustainer of all things, our eternal King. It's a problem, but it's about to change. Verse 11. So the Lord says to him, "Go out and stand on the mountain because I'm about to pass by." And then a great and powerful wind tears the mountain apart and shatters the rocks, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. After that, a gentle whisper. Okay, so where are my Midwest kids at again? Where are you at? Missouri, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, even Arkansas. Okay, all right, you're my people. All right, so Midwest kids, you know what's going on here, right? When you read the words, "a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart," what is that? That's a tornado. Yeah, we've been through a few of those, right? Yeah, okay. Anybody here from California? You have family from California? You visited California, like Mickey Mouse? Okay, so you guys are well aware, even if you just watch the news, that California has their fair share of earthquakes, right? Earthquakes, at the least, they fracture foundations. At the worst, they topple buildings, right? And on top of that, poor California, when the rest of the country is experiencing, seasons, like spring, winter, summer, fall, California seasons are like moderate chance of fire, severe threat of fire, and constant inferno. Like they're just always on fire. It's rough. But the thing about natural disasters is no matter where you're from, we all have our own special sauce, right? So this map of the United States is like my favorite map of all time because it really lays it out for us very well, I think. So we've got the hurricanes in the Gulf. Any Gulf people? Okay. We've got blizzards in the north. Blizzards. Anybody from Hawaii? Murderous mountains. That's a real thing. But my personal favorite, all across the South, air made of hot soup. That is truth. See, that is an accurate map right there. So the good news for all of us, though, is that typically we only have to deal with one natural disaster at a time. But poor Elijah, and he gets nailed with 3. And I know that this might seem a little bit drastic at first, but you've got to remember the mindset that Elijah is in right now. He is so overcome by angst that he can't even see straight. And so God uses these natural disasters to just kind of reorient his servant. Because Elijah doesn't know who he is, and it's clear that he's clearly forgotten who God is as well. And so God captures Elijah's attention through wind, quake, and fire, and then God leans in and he whispers truth. That moments earlier, Elijah wouldn't have been able to hear. No, but just so we're clear, when it says that the Lord was not in the wind, the quake, or the fire, this doesn't mean that they were not of God. No, actually, we see descriptors just like this being spoken of other places in Scripture, descriptors of God. Like 2 Samuel 22:11, David sings that our God soars on the wings of the wind. In Psalm 11, it says that God will rain down burning sulfur on the wicked, and perhaps Isaiah 29:6 gives us the clearest picture of what's happening right outside Elijah's cave. It says that the Lord Almighty will come with thunder and earthquake and great noise, with windstorm and tempest and flames of a devouring fire. So when it says that the Lord was not in the disasters, what it really means is that the natural disasters were not the main point. They were just kind of the pre-show, if you will. This is God reminding Elijah that he is absolutely all-powerful, that he is still on his throne, and that he is not afraid. God demonstrates to Elijah that while he has always shown himself in huge and wondrous ways, creation, flood, exodus, plagues, sea, manna, Acts of the Prophets, aka altar showdown, right? And he will still continue to show himself in huge and wondrous ways. His primary mode of communication is about to change. Before, you just had to see it to believe it. But now you have to listen. God's works are still very real. But if you want to know God fully, you have to get to know his word. And that's why I love Elijah's response in verse 13. Because it says that when Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and he went out and he stood at the mouth of the cave. Elijah hears the voice of God and he responds immediately. Now, does this mean that Elijah's not afraid anymore? No, I don't think so. And I think that becomes clear in the next little interchange that happens. But I think what this tells us is that maybe eliminating fear altogether isn't really our main concern. We don't necessarily need to minimize our fear as much as we need to maximize our God. It's all about perspective. See, Elijah got confused for a moment. His mission didn't go as planned. His victory was short-lived. His story was coming to an end. And so God gave Elijah some perspective, and he simply whispered, "It's not your story, and I'm not done." And so now that Elijah has his perspective on right, God has the opportunity to ask him this question again. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And this time, Elijah responds the exact same way. Okay, so I know at first this looks a little weird, and I've heard some people read this part of Elijah's story and say, "Seriously? Again? Like, what a crybaby. Get over it, man, you know?" But I think we need to take another look at this. Because yes, Elijah's words are exactly the same, but his posture is entirely different. See, the first time that Elijah responded to the Lord, he was hidden away, ashamed and angry of what had become of him. But this time, Elijah is standing before the Lord reporting for duty. Is Elijah scared for his own life? Of course he is. But that's not all. Elijah is distraught like never before because as far as he can tell, Israel is not going to be redeemed. I mean, God sent Elijah to go speak to his people, to plead with his people, to show his people how to get back on the right track, and it didn't work. So yeah, Elijah's upset. But seeing the greatness of God, it has this tendency to make all the troubles of man shrink to their proper size. And so because of Elijah's ability to see God and to hear God over and above everything else that is weighing on him, God is now able to finish what he came up on this mountain to do. And in verses 15 through 18, God lets Elijah know there are 7,000 other faithful Israelites ready to join you in battle. And then he gives him 3 tasks to fulfill his mission and to keep the restoration of Israel moving forward. He tells him to anoint 2 kings and to then anoint a new Elisha as the new prophet for Israel. So the story, this particular part of Elijah's story, it's great. It's incredible. But I want you to understand something. It's actually not all that unique. In fact, I wonder if some of you who are kind of familiar with the Bible, maybe over the last couple of days as you've listened to Elijah's story unfold, I wonder if some of you have sat there and thought, man, this sounds really familiar. Like Elijah, he confronts an evil king on behalf of God's people. Well, Moses did that too when he confronted Pharaoh. Elijah did battle with Ahab's prophets, and Moses did that too when he challenged Pharaoh's court magicians. Elijah traveled through the desert for 40 days. The Hebrew children traveled through the desert for 40 years. And it's not just Moses either. I mean, Abraham, we talked about this. Abraham was up on Mount Sinai meeting with God about this covenant promise, and Elijah goes to the exact same place. And then, of course, Elijah's frustration with Israel's hard hearts. I mean, it's reminiscent of Jonah, calling it quits, declaring the people of God unworthy of saving. And you know what? It's not just the Old Testament either. I mean, Elijah's story has a lot in common with another prophet, this one in the New Testament, a prophet who was also a priest and a king, Jesus. Because when Jesus came on the scene, he started doing all kinds of miracles, healing the lame and the blind, the sick and the mute, feeding the hungry, raising the dead. And the powers that be, the Pharisees, the Jewish leaders, they weren't impressed. Their minds were made up. They believed what they believed, and it wasn't Jesus. And you know what Jesus told them? He said, you won't believe until you see the greatest sign of all time, the death and resurrection of the Word. So see, this story, God's story, it's full of broken covenant, idol worship, hard hearts, unrepentance. I mean, it continues from the Old Testament to the New Testament, from the New Testament to today. Even if you're not familiar with all of those stories that I walk through, you get the point. It's just like Brad told us on night one. Where there are people, there will be sin. It's always been part of the story. It always will be part of the story. And I know that this can feel really overwhelming and even defeating, but I want you to see this as good news about our God, because He knows. He knows that His people will continue to walk away from Him, and yet He refuses to stop coming after us. And that's why when I see this question from God, what are you doing here? I know that this is less a question of condemnation and more a question of invitation. I mean, is this where God wanted Elijah? No, because He knew what else was out there, because He knew how this story could unfold. Because even though Elijah was, God never was shaken, not once. God didn't want him here, He wanted him there. And so here's what God did to help him see that. God reminded Elijah of His presence. God restored Elijah to community. And God rededicated Elijah to kingdom work. But here's what you've got to see. God was able to do those things. God was able to move Elijah from here to there because Elijah came out of his cave. So what's your here? Where have you run to that you know it's not part of the plan? What has left you feeling isolated and alone and despairing? Is it some kind of an addiction? Maybe for you it's jealousy of someone else. Or maybe the opposite of that, maybe for you it's pride. Perhaps it's some kind of sexual expression that you know is out of bounds when it comes to God. Maybe it's laziness, maybe it's disrespect. Is it possible that you've been hiding for so long you don't think you deserve to be free? Is it possible that whatever your here is, you don't think restoration is available to you? There is no redemption. There is no rededication. Well, if there's one thing that Elijah's story teaches us, it's this. Your past does not determine your potential. God's presence does that. I mean, when Elijah thought he had met his match in Jezebel and he just knew that his story was over, God said to him, "It's not your story and I'm not done." And then Elijah had to come out of the cave. He had to leave the darkness behind in order to receive forgiveness from sins, restoration to his community, and reinstatement into kingdom work. And when Jesus' disciples thought that they had met their match in the Roman government, and they just knew on Friday night after Jesus had died that their story was over, God said, "It's not your story, and I'm not done." And on Sunday morning, Jesus rose from the grave. He emerged after defeating the darkness so that all of them and all of us could have forgiveness from sins, restoration to community, and reinstatement into kingdom work. But here's the problem. Some of you have run right back to the cave. And some of you are so far back in the depths, you can't even see your own hand in front of your face. Some of you are a little closer to the front of the cave, but here's the thing, it's the same for all of you. You've come here this week thinking that you've met your match, fearful that your story is over. But a favorite preacher of mine, Christine Caine, she says that if you entrust God with your here, He will take you there. If you give God your now, He will take care of the then. And that then will see you saved, supported, and sent just like Elijah. But if God's going to continue His story, you got to come out of your cave. I know, just like Elijah knew, that this is not easy. You've chosen your cave for a reason. It's become your home. It's comfortable, and it's safe there. We've convinced ourselves that our caves of fear, anger, loneliness, apathy, shame, they're as good as it's going to get for us. And you know what? Honestly, if we will just remain in the darkness of our cave, then actually no one and no thing can harm us anymore. It's best case scenario. But guys, this is basic science. I mean, we all did the plant experiment in elementary school, right? Like you take two of the exact same kind of plants and you give them the exact same amount of soil and you feed them the exact same amount of fertilizer and you give them the exact same amount of water at the exact same time every single day. The one variable that's different is you put one plant in the light and one plant in the dark. And the changes are almost immediate. The plant in the light, it thrives and it grows and it blooms, but the plant in the darkness, it shrivels away until there's nothing left. And it's the same thing with people. Did you guys know that there are campaigns all over the United States right now to get solitary confinement usage in our prisons reduced? So solitary confinement, it puts prisoners in a dark 6-foot by 8-foot room all alone for up to 22 hours a day. Now, depending on what the prisoner has done to find themselves in solitary, they might be in there for a week. Typically, it's 15 days. But in the past, some have been in the darkness for a month or more. And again, the consequences, man, they're endless. They experience physical repercussions like chronic headaches, heart palpitations, oversensitivity to noise, muscle pain, weight loss, digestive problems, dizziness, loss of appetite. And the psychological issues, man, they range from anger, stress, loss of a sense of reality, suicidal thoughts, trouble sleeping, confusion, trouble concentrating, depression, psychotic episodes, hallucinations. It goes on and on. So you tell me again how the darkness is the best thing for you right now. Listen, I know some of you think your story is already over and there's nothing that can be done. But if it were, God would have closed the book and called it quits a long time ago. Now, the truth is, God's story is still being written, and your next chapter awaits. So would you just give him a chance? Just take the first step. Just walk out of your cave and just stand on the side of the mountain. I know that the journey will be painful, but I promise you, the view at the top, it'll take your breath away. But don't just engage him with your eyes. Engage him with your ears. Lean in and listen. And you gotta listen close because it's gentle, it's quiet, it's just a whisper, but it's clear. God is saying to you tonight, I'm not done. Yeah, it's his story, but he sure would like you in it. So come out of your cave and lay down your despair. God is here to take you there.